Welcome to Vermont Voices. I'm Sharice Madigan, and today we're joined by Meagan Gallagher from Planned Parenthood of Northern New England. She's the president and CEO of the organization, and she's here to talk with us about the national healthcare reform that's ongoing and the role of Planned Parenthood here in Vermont. So Meagan, I'd love to start out and have you tell us just a bit more about the work that Planned Parenthood does here in Vermont.
Sure. Planned Parenthood of Northern New England serves actually Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Here in Vermont, we have 12 health centers. We actually serve 11 of our 14 counties. We have a health center both in Bennington and in Rutland. At our health centers, we provide our patients with general gynecological services, including well woman exams, cancer screenings, birth control, testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections. We serve over 18,000 women and men in the state of Vermont. And in addition to being a healthcare provider, we are also an advocate for sexual and reproductive rights, and we are also an educator.
Great. And how have you been received by the Vermont government or the people of Vermont in terms of funding and support?
We are very fortunate. The state of Vermont is incredibly supportive of the work that we do, both from our elected officials to supporters on the street. Vermont is a really wonderful place to be Planned Parenthood.
Great. And how does that differ from the other states you work with, New Hampshire and Maine?
Well, what's universally true across northern New England is that the people are very supportive of our work. But we also know, I think we can all appreciate that the political environments in the three states are very, very different.
Definitely.
New Hampshire, of course, is a state that has a lot of swings from one election to another, both because of the role they play in national politics, and also because of the political beliefs held by the people of New Hampshire. So we have typically enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the state of New Hampshire, and actually that is somewhat unusual that there is bipartisan support in New Hampshire, but it does tend to look different depending on who is in office. Historically, in New Hampshire, we're incredibly fortunate to have an all-female, pro-women's health delegation to Congress. And then if we look at the state of Maine, we enjoy wonderful support in the House, and we also have an incredibly supportive delegation to Congress, though not universally supportive. Representative Shelley Pingree, Senator Angus King, and also Senator Collins are supporters of Planned Parenthood, particularly at this moment in time.
That's great to hear. And you use the phrase, it's unusual to hear bipartisan support, and it's so interesting that an issue like women's health care has become so politicized recently, and not just recently, unfortunately. Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times recently reported that one woman dies every 2 hours of cervical cancer, and almost all of those cases are preventable. What do you think statistics like that say about the priority of women's health care in our government right now?
Well, I think it is a challenge. The Nick Kristof's statistic was alarming.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we all need to pay attention to, and that's what makes it all the more concerning what we're hearing from Washington, both the fact that defunding Planned Parenthood has been included in the Affordable Care Act repeal, in addition to the devastating effect that the Affordable Care Act repeal would have on women's ability to access sexual and reproductive health care, particularly low-income women.
Absolutely. And here in Vermont, do you find that that's a niche that you're serving very well as low-income or minority women, or do you feel that it's more across-the-board support?
Absolutely. More than 50% of the people that we serve are under 100% of the federal poverty level.
Oh, wow.
So we are predominantly serving a low-income population. And here in Vermont, while we enjoy many incredibly positive sexual health status indicators like teen birth rates, rates of sexually transmitted infection, we still have a 50% unintended pregnancy rate.
Wow.
And so when we think about that, I certainly, as the CEO of Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, take that very seriously. and recognize that while we have done an incredible job of ensuring access through our 12 health centers to sexual and reproductive health care, there's still more work to do.
Absolutely. And do you feel part of that statistic, 50% of pregnancies being unintended, comes down to maybe education on reproductive health and
I think there are many layers to it. I think education is vitally important. I think access to health care is vitally important. And it challenges us to think about what access to health care means. And in this age of technology that really redefines the notion of access, it gives us new opportunities to think about how we can meet people where they are instead of expecting them to find their way through the healthcare system to a provider.
Absolutely. And can you give me some examples of those new opportunities that technology could provide?
Sure. Well, I think, of course, we're all very familiar with the internet, and just having health information available on the internet is a place to start. The Planned Parenthood website, which is a national website serving the entire country, gets millions of hits every month. And so that is a great place to start in terms of knowing that people have access to high quality information. We're also in other parts of the country piloting telemedicine services from your smartphone. So particularly in Minnesota and Washington, and hopefully coming soon to Vermont, a patient can download an app and then click on it and connect to a provider and have her birth control mailed to her. Wow. So that's the future of sexual and reproductive health care, and a really meaningful way to remove barriers to care.
Great. And speaking of barriers to care, how do you think the upcoming Healthcare Reform Act will really impact Planned Parenthood besides defunding it?
Well, when we think about, first, I'll take this opportunity to clarify defunding, because it is a bit of a wonky policy issue. What the language in the Affordable Care Act repeal does is it would eliminate Planned Parenthood's eligibility as a Medicaid provider. So really what it's doing is blocking patients' ability to access care at Planned Parenthood. But in addition to that, as we've seen from the Congressional Budget Office, it would reduce the number of people who have access to health insurance by nearly 14 million in 1 year. It would have a really dramatic impact. And I would say that since the Affordable Care Act passed, it's been one of the most transformative moments in sexual and reproductive health care, because it introduced no-cost preventive services, and included in those preventive services was birth control. So that meant instead of, even for insured women, instead of women having to choose the birth control that was most affordable, they were able to choose the birth control method that was right for them.
That's great.
And so that really changed the nature of the conversations that we had with patients. Instead of navigating with them what they could afford, we could just talk about their health care and the method that was best for them. So going backward in that regard will have a significant impact across the country. And also the fact that the number of people who would qualify for Medicaid would decrease so dramatically would be particularly devastating in terms of people's ability to access health care in general.
Absolutely. And how do you think that would reflect in terms of the real lives of women? How would they kind of feel that the changes in the healthcare reform?
They wouldn't have a way to pay for health care. So I think we have seen what that was like. The Affordable Care Act came out of people's experience in their inability to access health care, their inability to afford health care, because we know that it can be incredibly expensive to access health care if you don't have insurance. Of course, Planned Parenthood is committed to serving patients regardless of their ability to pay. So we are here for patients who don't have insurance, and we expect that our role in the healthcare system will be even more important if the repeal to the Affordable Care Act does pass into law.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Paul Ryan had said to negate the idea that losing Planned Parenthood and that funding would be devastating to women is saying, women can go to community health centers and they can absorb the clientele that Planned Parenthood would normally take. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the reality is here in Vermont, there are communities that we serve that don't have community health centers. So I think it's a pretty disingenuous remark on the speaker's part.
Absolutely. And how do you think that the national healthcare reform will impact Vermont specifically and the women of Vermont?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that obviously the decreased Medicaid rolls would have a significant impact. There are estimates that tens of thousands of Vermonters would no longer have access to health insurance. But one thing that I will say that is a positive about women's ability and actually men's ability to access sexual and reproductive health care here in Vermont is that last year the legislature passed a bill into law called the Birth Control Access Law, which actually codified that no-cost birth control provision of the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, wow.
So even if the Affordable Care Act is repealed and that benefit no longer exists at the federal level, Vermonters will still have access to no-cost birth control. So I think we are, again, it speaks to the incredible support that our elected officials have for women's health care and Vermonters' ability to access women's health care. And I mentioned men as well because that bill also extended the no-cost birth control benefit to vasectomy. So it also makes male birth control available at no cost.
True gender equality.
Exactly, exactly.
Great. And reproductive rights, it becomes kind of a euphemism almost for the abortion issue in a lot of cases. How do you feel that that conversation is kind of changing with the new administration that we've been faced with?
Certainly seeing President Trump as a candidate express incredibly disappointing views on a woman's right to access abortion services was a harbinger of what we can expect from this administration. We think of defunding of Planned Parenthood as really an attack on women's ability to access safe and legal abortion. And we expect the trend that we have seen over the last 10 years to chip away at women's ability to access abortion to continue under this administration. So we are prepared to fight for the next 4 years to ensure that women continue to have access to safe and legal abortion. It's a fundamental human right, and we are committed to protecting it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the trends from the last 10 years. How has the right to abortion really impacted women's lives and the rights to equal pay and equal work and equal rights?
I think it's fundamental. A woman's ability to control her reproductive life is essential to her ability to participate as an equal member of this society. There is a movie called Equal Means Equal, and there's a young woman from Texas who talks about a woman's reproductive destiny being her economic destiny. And I think that is the most succinct articulation of the importance of reproductive rights in a woman's lives. Her ability to finish school, her ability to achieve her career goals are directly linked to her reproductive freedom.
And autonomy, absolutely. And during the Women's March on Washington, there was a huge controversy over, a pro-life group wanting to be included in the Women's March. And, throughout the first, second, and third waves of the feminist movement, abortion has been an integral part of that movement. How do you think that plays out when it comes to large-scale activism like the Women's March?
Well, I think we saw how that was resolved, and I think the Women's March really embraced abortion rights as essential to women's ability to participate as equal members of our society. And I think when we talk about abortion rights, what we're talking about is a woman's ability to terminate a pregnancy if that's the right decision for her, or not terminate a pregnancy if that's the right decision for her. So it's really that choice and autonomy, as you said, that I think is essential to the women's movement.
Yeah, And not too long after the Women's March, there was also a pro-life march on Washington that Vice President Mike Pence also spoke at. How did that resonate with Planned Parenthood?
Well, I think the Women's March was much larger than the anti-choice march on Washington, and I think that spoke volumes in terms of where this country is, in terms of support for both abortion rights and the Roe versus Wade decision. Over 70% of Americans support the Roe versus Wade decision, and I think it's important for our elected officials in Washington to remember that.
Absolutely. And how does the upcoming nomination of a Supreme Court justice kind of resonate with Planned Parenthood?
Yeah, we're concerned about some of the decisions that he has made, particularly with regard to reproductive rights. He supported the Hobby Lobby decision that the Supreme Court recently handed down, which basically said that a private corporation's religious rights supersede a woman's right to access contraceptives through her employer's insurance plan. And as we think about a woman's ability to both control her body and plan her pregnancies, access to contraception is vitally important. So having a Supreme Court justice that does not support women's rights in that regard is very concerning.
Absolutely. And I noticed earlier you made a point to say anti-choice rather than pro-life.
I did.
Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Well, I think as we think about this movement, since Roe versus Wade was decided more than 40 years ago, so much of it comes down to the language we use.
Yes.
Planned Parenthood is attacked because we are an abortion provider and because there is such a strong ideological opposition to a woman's right to abortion. And so our opposition has tried to win the narrative by reclaiming the language. So things like language like pro-life to define our opposition isn't accurate. Everybody supports life.
Yes.
Planned Parenthood, first and foremost, some of the most powerful patient stories that we have to tell are those patients that come to Planned Parenthood and as a result of their visit with Planned Parenthood choose to become parents. Going to Planned Parenthood is not about choosing abortion necessarily. It's about understanding what your options are when you are facing potentially a pregnancy that was unanticipated. But we are supportive of a woman's right to choose to continue that pregnancy or not, depending on what's right for her. So to see the language of this movement, to see our movement co-opted by the language of our opposition is something that we really resist. And we are very focused on keeping abortion rights in the space of women's personal health care decisions, because that's what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, not so much a political issue when you talk about it that way.
Right.
Yeah, and during the 2016 election, there was a lot of vitriol over the medical research that Planned Parenthood was conducting using fetal tissue. How did that impact the Northern New England offices?
Well, Planned Parenthood Northern New England does not participate in fetal tissue research. But that being said, fetal tissue research has advanced medicine in many ways, including aiding the development of vaccines, and is a critical part of the evolution of evidence-based medicine. But that being said, the video smear campaign launched against Planned Parenthood under the auspices that we profit from the participation in fetal tissue research was another example of our opposition trying to distort the work that we do. It was incredibly confusing for people. And it again put us on the defensive in terms of having to clarify what exactly was going on, that this was nothing other than another political attempt of our opposition to undermine the work that we do. And ultimately, we saw in time that the truth came out. One of our supporters said to me, you know, a lie makes its way around the globe while the truth is putting its shoes on. And that, I think, is the best encapsulation of the experience that we had in that moment, is that that lies are far more sensational in our media these days than the truth is. And it takes a while for the truth to make its way through the lies. But unfortunately, the truth did indeed prevail. And people came to understand that the videos were heavily edited and incredibly distortive of what was happening for those affiliates that do participate in fetal tissue research.
Absolutely. And going forward, what is the strategy for Planned Parenthood, and specifically Planned Parenthood of Northern New England?
In this moment, are you thinking of this in terms of potential defunding or just in general?
In the face of potential defunding, in terms of heavy opposition from the right, and also in general, to continue providing the services you provide and doing the great work that you do in our community?
Well, first and foremost, I will say that we are going to continue providing the services that we provide. In this moment where we're under attack, one of the most profound experiences we have is the incredible support of our patients. Mm-hmm. Our patients are so grateful every day for the work that we do, and in moments like this, especially grateful. We have people walking in off the streets on a daily basis telling us how important the work that we do is. So we remain committed to keeping our doors open and being here for the patients that we serve. Nothing is more important. And we remain committed to being the fiercest and the boldest advocates possible for sexual and reproductive health. Again, the people of Northern New England stand with us. And actually, Americans stand with us. 75% of Americans support federal funding for Planned Parenthood's preventative services. And those are pretty powerful numbers. And I mentioned the 50% unintended pregnancy rate, and that reflects the fact that in addition to all of the wonderful work that we do, we still have work to do to connect people to high quality reproductive health care, and we intend to continue to do that. We stand strongly with the women and men that we serve. We are going to ensure that they have access to sexual and reproductive health care, both preventive services as well as access to abortion care.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck with that fight.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.